Members of City Council, please attend a call meeting of the City Council to be held in the sixth floor conference room, 801 Crawford Street, 6 p.m., Monday, March 10, 2014, for the purpose of a public work session. In addition, you may consider a motion to go into closed meeting by order of the mayor. Mr. Cherry?
Here.
Mr. Evans?
Here.
Mr. Meeks?
Here.
Mr. Moody?
Here.
Ms. Simmons?
Here.
Ms. Randall?
Here.
Mayor Wright?
Here.
Mr. Rowe?
Thank you, Deborah. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Good evening.
We have a great thing back in Portsmouth, a great person back.
Great person.
Thing being our director of intergovernmental relations, person being our dear colleague.
Come on. Come on.
I want an autograph.
Not only did she survive all the bad weather and did it with like a trooper, but she kept us safe in Richmond. And I can't tell you, we don't have enough time tonight to tell you the things that she does behind the scenes and in front too, to protect the city and the citizens. And she's going to give you a report. It's not over. And as Yogi Berra said, it ain't over
Until it's
until it's over.
Thank you, John. Good evening, Mayor.
Good evening.
Members of council, city manager, and staff. It's my pleasure to be here and not there. Going to give you a quick briefing on what's going on right now at the General Assembly. As you've all heard on the news, the General Assembly adjourned on Saturday at the afternoon. All of the legislation has been passed, but what didn't get passed was the budget. They had agreed on the caboose bill, which is the bill that continues the funding for the rest of this fiscal year, but it wasn't actually voted on because they have rules of procedures that they follow, that they set every General Assembly session. And part of the rules of procedure is that the legislators are supposed to be given the budgets 36 hours prior to voting on them. With all of what was going on up there, they weren't able to get them printed into the legislators in time. So therefore, the caboose bill was not voted on. It was not taken up. They're supposed to take it up when they come back on the 24th. That's when the special session begins, 24th of March. With the General Assembly not passing a budget, that opens the door now for Governor McAuliffe to put in his budget. And so it's going to be interesting to see if he's not only just going to do the biennium, but if he'll also tweak in the caboose budget bill as well.
We're talking about two budget bills. We're talking about the caboose bill that she's talking about, which amends the current budget. The one that was stopped at 18 months ago expires on this coming June 30th. So they didn't pass that because of what Sherry just told you. But looming, that's even bigger, is the budget for the next biennium.
Thanks. And for the city, there were a couple of things in the Senate version when they amended the introduced budget that was really good for us. 599 was one of them, which is our public safety funding. Because of the way that particular formula works, they look at your population as well as your crime rates, and there's some other things that go into it. And so our crime rate has gone down, and our population has gone down. Ergo, we were beginning to lose money, and most of the urban cities would be losing money. What the Senate did in their proposed budget was they put a stopgap in it. They gave us a baseline of FY14 so that we could never get any less than we got in 14. And any new money would be portioned out over top of that. So in the long run, for all of the cities in the Virginia First cities in the urban core, we would benefit in the long run. Whether or not that stays in the budget, we'll see when things progress, as things progress. The big impasse was on, as you know, Medicaid spending, whether or not to expand it. The Senate Finance had a bill where they wanted to do the Marketplace Virginia, which was going to make it a private option for those people who could not qualify through the Affordable Care Act because they didn't make enough, but yet they didn't qualify for Medicaid because they made too much. So then they would be able to pick up that gap there. The big issue is, what happened, let me back it up. We're losing about $1.7 billion a year in the state for not having any type of a marketplace or not having expanded Medicaid, because we're paying taxes to the state. And it's similar to when we had the Transportation Act last year, and we were trying to not lose federal funding on transportation because we were using construction dollars for maintenance, and we was running out of money in that pocket. So we wouldn't have been able to pull down that money from the federal government for transportation. This is even larger because we're losing even more money on the Medicaid piece. What Senate Finance did is that they had a bill, and what they did is they rolled the bill into their budget because they knew that if they left it as a bill, the House was going to kill it. The House had a big problem with that, and they wanted a clean budget. They wanted it to come down without the Medicaid in it, and the Senate wasn't going to go there, so ergo the impasse. So this is why we don't have a budget at this time.
Danny's got a question.
The gap, what's the number of people in the gap? Is that the 450,000? 450,000 talking about tonight on the news? That's costing us 1.7 billion?
A year. Yeah, it's pretty big. The legislators are going to be coming down from Richmond over the next 2 weeks, and they're going to be hosting town hall meetings. Senator Locke and Senator Lucas will be having one here in Portsmouth for one of our schools over the next 2 weeks, so listen out for that. And of course, you're going to have the proponents that's going to come down to extol the virtues of it, and then you're going to have the opponents that's going to go home to say, what's the problem, why we don't want to do this. And then we'll go back and see what happens. Any questions on that piece?
Yeah, the governor was here today. We had a huge press conference over at Maryview Hospital. It was well attended. Four of the mayors, myself, Linda Johnson from Suffolk, George Wallace from Hampton, and Paul Frame from Norfolk were there. Will Sessoms didn't come, but sent word that he was in full support of this and this whole initiative. And so it was well attended, quite a bit of press there, and I'm sure it'll be all over the news today. But they put up a few slides that pretty much said the same thing that you said, and so it's going to be interesting.
Definitely.
It's a challenge.
Within that 400,000 citizens of the Commonwealth is about 21,000 veterans
Yes.
that qualify,
Yes.
and which
A couple of legislators made that point as well when they were arguing for it, but
Is all of our delegation on board?
nope. There you go. There you go.
Answer the question.
No.
To the best of
to the best of my knowledge, no. I would say the majority are.
Good answer. All right, thank you.
Okay.
All right, very good.
Diplomatically stated.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on from there, I know you have other things to talk about tonight. I was going to just briefly touch on some other pieces. Like 2,888 pieces of legislation were introduced. Out of that, we monitored about 400 pieces, and then I was going to touch on what our legislative package and the results of that.
Yeah. And
Okay.
before she leaves the budget, as long as the budgets are hanging fire, we don't have solid numbers for 599. That's our biggest number on our side. State aid for education, K through 12, is hanging fire. So the schools are going to be perplexed until the state, the General Assembly, adopts a budget for the next biennium.
Thank you, John. We had several public policy issues in our package. Legislative fix for the tolls, elimination for depot and M&T taxes, street maintenance formula change, public transit funding for HRTA, host cities of Virginia Port Authority, equitable funding, Opportunity Educational Institute, and enterprise zones. So quickly, I just want to touch a little bit on each one of those. The legislative fix for the tolls, of course, there was no legislation done for that because of the Supreme Court decision. However, we do have some friends in the administration, and we were successful in having some more help, I guess aid, in dealing with the toll situation. So, of course, the governor has put money in there, bring it down for the next 3 years. We also had a bill that passed that says that by September 1st, they have to get rid of that 50-cent maintenance fee on the easy passes.
That did pass.
That
That's right.
passed.
Good.
Yeah, and that was also something that the governor was pushing for.
That's huge.
And they also have, in that same
We
bill,
multiply it by.
in that same bill, VDOT was directed to look at wider distribution for the Easy Passes statewide as well. So that was done as well. On the elimination of the B-pole and M&T taxes, of course, that's an issue that comes up every General Assembly session. I'm glad to say that working with our colleagues in Virginia Municipal Leagues, VACO, and Virginia First Cities, we were very successful at getting the very bad ones killed. So we're safe again for one more session. There were a few that slipped through, such as they have the right to appeal business license tax classifications, whether the locality has conducted an audit, issued an assessment, or taken another action or not. Real property tax notice of assessment, that I know we tried, Janie, we tried real hard. But that bill requires that additional information be included in a notice of change in assessments or reassessments of real property taxes issued by localities. And then there were a few others. The constitutional officers, localities shall not reduce funding for personnel, etc. That was a pretty big one. When the bill first went in, it was saying that you had, if you were going to make any changes in their budget, you had to have a public hearing, and there was a whole lot of things they set out in that bill, and we worked really hard to fix it. So now, the way the bill comes out is that if there's going to be a reduction, they're to get a 2-week, 14 days notice prior to the adoption of your budget. And then if the constitutional officer determines that the proposed budget cuts would impair the performance of their statutory duties, they have the right to make a written objection to the local governing body within 7 days after the receipt of the notice. And then they also send that objection to the compensation board. So it kind of just puts them on notice and provides for some means of communication. The street formula, maintenance formula changes, we didn't have anything there. They didn't do anything with that. Our position was we didn't want anything changed if it was going to take away money from us. We're putting in more money for our street maintenance than we actually receive from the state. So that, nothing happened with that. However, we did have a bill passed that Virginia First Cities actually championed, and it was funding among highway systems, and it includes now primary state highway systems extensions. The part of the primary highway that runs through a city or a town, in the list of highways that received 25% for reconstruction or deteriorated highways, will now get funding as well. And then there was the Commonwealth Transportation Board, which allocations within highway construction districts. I'll send this out so you guys can read through it. On the public transit HRTA piece, we were pushing for a direct funding source for the Hampton Roads Transit Authority. We didn't get any traction on that, unfortunately.
We tried.
We tried. We host cities of the Virginia Port Authority, equitable funding. We didn't have a bill or a budget amendment in for that. However, in the introduced budget, Governor McDonald had bumped up the pilot fees. So we were looking at about a 5% increase. Again, we need to wait to see what happens with the budget to see if it remains in there, it stays intact. So that was a good thing. We might have been looking at extra maybe $20,000 or something on the pilot fees. On the Opportunity Educational Institute, our position there was that we did not feel that should be implemented until the lawsuit was taken care of before they started taking over failing schools and putting them into this institute. There were several pieces of legislation that went in to either kill it, to deter it. There's budget amendments that were put in to take the money away from it. The bills to kill the OEI didn't pass. And again, with the budget, we'll see what happens when we move forward later on in the month. And then finally, enterprise zones. And our position on the enterprise zones was that we did not want any changes made to that program unless if they decided to expand it, they had to add more money to it. There were several bills that came in that was going to change the nature of the program. What they want to do ultimately is to make it not locality distress-wide, but census tract in more pockets, because it's a good program. A lot of people want to buy in, but everybody's not totally fiscally stressed. So for those areas that just have pockets of poverty or pockets of distress, they want to be able to utilize this program as well, which is fine, but we need to know how much money needs to be added in it so that we, people in our cities that already have these zones are not negatively impacted by the expansion. Delegate James, I believe, for his bill, it didn't go through, but we carried it
one?
over. Excuse me?
Which one?
On the enterprise zones.
Oh, the enterprise.
Yeah, it was carried over, and it will be asking for an administrative study through the Secretary of Commerce and Labor, Mr. Jones, to actually look at the program to see what can be done, if anything, and if it can be expanded, how much money would it take to actually make it viable? Okay, and then quickly moving forward, then we had a couple of legislative requests. The first one was for economic relief for downtown businesses. Of course, you know, we tried really hard with that one, but the legislators were very empathetic, yet and still they could not justify setting statewide precedents to pass, make a fund up like that, so that failed. Public-Private Transportation Act, we had a request in that any large projects over $1 billion had to be reviewed by the General Assembly before they were to actually finalize the comprehensive agreement. The administration had came out and asked our legislators to pull the bills and give them a chance to actually work through this administratively and look at what processes they could address themselves without it going through the General Assembly. We did speak with council, and our council agreed to go along with that. So Senator Lucas and Delegate James were carrying the bills for us. Senator Alexander also had a bill. He also pulled his. Delegate Joanna had a bill. He did not pull his. His bill died in committee. One thing I think that kind of came out of that early on, the nexus, I think, is going to be the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission, which that bill did pass. A question?
All right, Sherry, one of the things that we've noticed in the past with some of the things, our delegations do not always come together. And one of the things we used to be able to bank on, all of us in the same area would come together and push them. And I've noticed that there's a little bit more of a divide. And we used to have a little bit more unity when it came to major impact areas that would affect the whole area. And as I had picked up on it, I was beginning to see some of our groups in the area branching out in cities in different areas, where when we were pulling together, we were able to get more accomplished, and we got a greater recognition through the state. And I had noticed that as I viewed some of the sessions.
Yes, ma'am. And I think that's part of what this commission is going to be able to do as well, because you have your chief elected officials from all of your jurisdictions within Planning District 23 are going to be on this commission. PPTAs for this area will be addressed by that commission, and they will be negotiated by that commission. So you're actually pushing it down to the local level, which was the larger complaint that we had and others had with it, that these things were being done at the state level and without a lot of local input. So that's going to eliminate that.
Good.
Okay. Casino
And now
gaming.
five members from the legislature are going to be on that board.
Yeah,
That
and that
was
was a
discussed
sticking point
today with the
because there was
governor.
supposed to be some parity. So it's been 3 and 3, but they wound up doing 2 and 3. So you're gonna have 2 senators and 3 House members, right? Casino gaming, of course, we had a great push on that one as well. The bill did successfully come out of the subcommittee and it went to committee. The committee and Senator Lucas agreed to hold the bill in committee and request an administrative study from, again, the Secretary of Commerce and Labor to look at the potential impact, positive or negative, that bringing business into the state of this nature would have on the state of Virginia. So it's been carried over to the 2015 session, and it will be reintroduced. And I'm hearing that it's also going to be put in on the House side next year as well. Churchland Bridge request. We did have a request for $21 million for the Churchland Bridge. We pushed really hard for that too, but unfortunately, due to the initial way that the project was set up funding-wise, we couldn't switch it from being revenue sharing over to having the state pick it up and do the project. So, but we are now looking at some federal assistance that we might be able to pull down for the Tiger 6 grants and some other things to try to have that done.
How's that look?
We're just starting to look at it now. And I'm sure there's some people in the room that could speak a little bit more authoritatively than I could if you needed.
Your answer's good. We
Okay.
just started.
And then finally, the other big thing that happened, one of the big issues up there was mental health. And of course, that came out of the fact of the tragedy from Senator Dees and his son. So there was a slew of mental health bills that went through. And just wanted to touch on a couple of the major ones for you. Senate Bill 260 was Senator Dees' bill, and it's on emergency custody, web-based psychiatric bed registry, custody order, valid up to 24 hours. So what they've done, in short, is that they have changed the amount of time a person can be held. They are putting in a web-based service where all beds that are available in the public or private sector will be on the web base, so that if you need a bed, you can find one. They have changed the mandatory outpatient treatment acknowledgement of transfer. Now CSBs have to report within 5 days if they have a transfer come in or if a transfer goes out. So they've changed a lot of those things. And again, without going through too much of this, we'll have this forwarded over to you for your...
All right, very good.
Okay, and again, so we go back into session on the 24th of March.
24.
And Sherry will still be up there, well, not still be, she'll go back up there on the 24th. So Sherry, good job, Sherry.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you.
She does it well.
The next item, budget adjustments, that's just a reminder that we'll bring back to you an ordinance to amend the current budget, and most of those are transfers, and that will be at your next, not Tuesday's meeting, but 2 weeks ahead. And we'll get that, we'll have it on the Monday agenda 2 weeks hence. The State of the City is on track. It's April the 2nd. It's being advertised at a lot of venues. I'm speaking tomorrow morning. I'm not really taking questions at the local Chamber of Commerce meeting. We listen to you in the process of taking your comments and working them into the narrative. The state of the, not to let the cat out of the bag.
It's good.
State of the city is good.
That's right. It's always.
Which brings us to really the most important thing on the agenda tonight, and that's a discussion about our new zoning ordinance. I say new because it is still new, even though it was adopted in 2010. And the first assignment that I gave Bob, even before he reported in September, was to go through the zoning ordinance, because I sensed as your city manager that there were some unintended consequences with the passage of this ordinance. And it's not just one ordinance, and Bob will show you that it has some very major components, and some don't apply citywide. My sense is that it was really awkward and difficult to implement here in Portsmouth. We want to foster and invite and partner with economic development. We want to encourage the right type of development. And we're finding, as you'll see tonight, that our zoning ordinance presents some very significant challenges. So I asked Bob to take the worst first, go through these documents and look at the document from every perspective and where we have issues to come up with fixes. And of course, the fix is an amendment to the zoning ordinance, and that process is prescribed by state code. It's considered by the Planning Commission. Once they get satisfied with the proposed ordinance, they have a series of public hearings. From that, they can amend the proposed ordinance and make a recommendation to you, and then you start that process too. You have a series of public hearings. So we have a ways to go, but these fixes that we need to do are very, very important if we want to partner with those who want to continue to make our city a great place. So and we're not throwing stones at the old ordinance. what I'd like for you to do is think of this as being a seminar in graduate school in which you're taking a course in planning and the several philosophies that exist about how one plans for both an urban type city, a suburban type city, and maybe a rural community, because there are different approaches and different philosophies, and they all don't work in the same locality. So, Bob.
Before you get started, Bob, just like to remind council that we've got a closed meeting item after this, and it deals with a specific zoning code matter. So if you have any questions that relate to that in particular, if you just hold them for the closed meeting, that would
Thank you,
be
George.
helpful.
That's important.
Good evening, Mayor Wright, members of council. I'll probably turn out to be one of your most boring professors by the time I get through this thing. Hopefully not too bad. Some of the material may seem a little bit dry, but I think it's important in the conversation we've been having here about making sure the city council really understands the regulatory regime in which land use is being regulated in the city. And so I'm going to give a little bit of background. This is sort of the boring professorial part, talk about zoning just in general. I'll probably use some terms that may not be common to you, but you need to know. You may be familiar with the term Euclidean zoning. And for people who don't know that term, that's the zoning we had in place, still do have in place in part. But that was sort of the standard zoning that was used all over the United States. It was went through a Supreme Court challenge back in 1926. And when the Euclidean zoning case was, Euclid is actually a community in Ohio that was sued. And when they had established a zoning concept with some land use regulations in it they were challenged on. And when that was upheld by the Supreme Court, that became the basis. And their zoning code sort of became the basis that spread out all over the country. And so when you hear people talk about Euclidean zoning, it's based off that original 1926 concept. And that concept allowed land uses in different locations and allows you regulating building heights and setbacks. And I think you have to, just for the moment, if you step back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, recognize the United States was a lot different place. It's very unhealthy. Land uses weren't regulated. You could have a factory right next to your house. You could have, environmental regulations were pretty much non-existent. So the cities weren't very attractive places. And so there had been a movement started actually as late as the late 1800s to try to do something about that. And from that, the first zoning goes, and then that became sort of the law of the land. So just remember Euclidean zoning, the city of Portsmouth adopted its first zoning ordinance using that concept in 1961. So bear in mind, we've had 50 plus years to apply, modify. For those who might have looked at the original zoning codes and see what those look like, you'll see what we have today is a much different animal. So anyway, as I mentioned, Euclidean zoning, break things into land use. So sure remember the residential, commercial, industrial, every pretty much standard stuff. And up until 2010, this was the city zoning code. In fact, not even all of this. And it probably looks thicker than it is because Fred has, this is Fred's. It's all tabbed. Mine would not have been tabbed because I'm not that industrious, so mine would not have been that thick. But that's what the code looked like. You can see that's the whole city zoning code pre-2010. So now let me back up a little bit and go to about 10 or 15 years ago, and there started to be some attacks on that concept of Euclidean zoning. And there were primary attacks on it, whether it was creating sprawl by separating land uses. We were getting too much sprawl, too auto-oriented. And it wasn't creating the kind of communities people wanted, and there was a better way to do it. And instead of being through segregating land uses, the idea was we can do a better job if we just control how things are built, how they look. And we'll let the function follow form. I think it's the best way I could describe that. So we're going to create a process to do land use regulation primarily built on design, building standards. And from that, we've had two alternatives that have sort of taken hold. One of them is called the SMART code. You may have heard the term transect. If you look on our map here, you'll see T3, T4, T5, T6. Those are transects. That's from the SMART code. And this is a a land regulating concept that's built upon land use intensity increasing as the numbers of the transect go higher. So in other words, least intensive transect we would have would be a T3. T6 is most intensive. And the concept of the smart code actually starts with a 1, and that's like open rural land use. And so if you look in the smart code and the way it's built, it is built off of that transect concept. If you're bored and having trouble sleeping some night, you can look up the Center for Applied Transect Studies, and you can read all about the concept of how they came up with this transect plan. And anyway, it's just a progressive thing. And one of the theories behind that would be, if you're going to do large buildings like you might do in a T6 downtown, they would contend that we've also seen communities put them way out where they don't belong. And so therefore that's bad land use practice. And you ought to put the big buildings, the intensive land uses, and you ought to go along with it. And normally if you didn't have a city like ours with a river in the middle, that'd be your downtown. So the T6 would really be downtown, and then you move out and the intensity of land use would decline as you go along. So that's one, and we have it. There's another type of form-based code, which you might be more familiar with, and it's called form-based code. And that's primarily promoted by the Form-Based Code Institute. It's a nonprofit organization, and they've been promoting this for about 20 years. And this is ours, right here in the D2. Same general concept. You're focusing on building scale, the placement of buildings, the relationship to the street, to the public realm. The appearance and the arrangement of buildings is intended to define character instead of whatever the land uses are going on inside. It uses, and both of these use prescriptive design standards. The code tells you what you must build at the minimum. We'll talk about that in a second. And the best known example in Virginia is another one to look up, Columbia Pike in Arlington. They've had this form-based code in place there since 2003, and they modify it regularly, but you can look up Columbia Pike, they're regularly referenced. So that's where the form-based code is. As I mentioned, it's really based on building design concepts. Again, function following form. And
one thing to point out, that works when you got a line that stretches out the door, the steps, and around the corner of developers who want to develop in that area. Because you say, if you don't like our form, we go to the next one. You don't like our form, we go to the next one. It's difficult when you don't have that line. It doesn't stretch out the door, it doesn't go down the steps and out the building, to create partnerships that make sense. Am I making sense on that point? So this might work in an area where you do have a long line like that if this developer won't do it, then the next one will.
But didn't our previous code prohibit like mixed-use development?
well, most of the codes are segregated, but you had zoning districts that had some mixed uses in there. If you remember, like the traditional neighborhood district that was done for Newport had mixed uses in it. So as I was mentioning, as the old Euclidean zoning was moving along, people were taking that and modifying it, try to create mixes. If you ever looked at our old zoning at the end of the 2010, we had 1,000 different zoning districts in there. So it doesn't necessarily prohibit it, but it was harder to get to. And the downtown had mixed uses in it. The downtown district actually had what I call mixed uses in it. But just to give you sort of a difference in the two, if you think about the downtown having something would tell you, or a district saying your maximum building height is 35 feet, or your maximum building height is 50 feet, that's a maximum. Whatever you do up to there, that's up to you. Think about a form-based code saying your minimum building height is 3 stories, or 4 stories, or your minimum number of dwelling units is 60. It sets a standard, a design standard intended to create the building, the form, and so it's much more prescriptive. I think it's the best way. So to do that, I mentioned before, old zoning code, you want to come downtown now, you got to play with these.
Okay. But Bob, one of the things too that probably led to a lot of that was, because I came over here, I was a young woman, was based on segregation. You could not have but so much intermingling, even with the downtown area. I'm a young person, and I remember when, because I could not go into certain places in downtown, but yet I was teaching in Mount Hermon. So you know what I went through.
So let me walk through our documents here. If you're in the form-based code, this is your form-based code book, which also requires you to use these other books as well, because they interreference. It's your downtown design manual, is your downtown master plan and waterfront strategy, and of course, this is what most people think of as our zoning ordinance. But if you're downtown, it's all of these, and they reference each other. And there are regulatory requirements for downtown that are covered in these other books. So you just can't, you don't have one source. And the only reason I point that out is it creates a very complicated zoning scheme. Very, very complicated, both to design into if you're a developer. It's also very complicated to review if you're staff and you're trying to make sure you're covering the bases. So that's really the sort of the zoning scheme we have downtown.
Deborah.
Let's see here.
A question. Are these zonings, do they push persons that want to come here to build away, being so complex?
Well, that's what we're starting to hear, and I think you got to remember there's two factors. We're trying to find a balance here. You know, the city wanted to promote certain quality of development, certain kind of land use, and so you have a zoning concept put in there. It does increase the complexity. I'll tell you, it makes it more expensive just because we're prescribing design. You may not have wanted to build a 4-story building. I might be telling you, I'm sorry, you still have to build one. That's the code requirement. So I would say that there's likely, and I can't say I've had tons of people, but there's likely an effect on some people saying, that's just too much for me to get involved in. It's too complicated, or it's whatever. So it's relatively complicated. It's complicated for us. I mean, I've only been working at this, since September, and I can tell you, Fred's been doing this since the inception. Sure. It's very complicated. Not that you can't do it, but it's very difficult. And one of the things that does happen when you're dealing with, for example, out-of-town architects, out-of-town developers, this isn't the kind of thing you just sort of pick up instantaneously. Yeah. It takes some time to know, because every time we think we know something, we find out there's something in there we didn't know. Yeah. And that's become one of the problems in here. So I'm going to move to this one other, and I mentioned that was downtown. If you go outside of downtown, we have a modified version of Euclidean zoning. So if you look at the zoning map, you'll see it's new nomenclature, new terminology. We don't have C and M1 or whatever, but they have basically have same kind of zoning districts that are outside of downtown. The big difference that's happened in the zoning code, or at least in my opinion, is there's a lot of development standards that have been added into the zoning code. So now we start having much more requirements in terms of where you put the buildings, the architecture of the buildings, how they orient on the site. There's more regulatory regime on parking, on landscaping. Not that, and most of that's for getting good development. But what we're finding, and this is just sort of back to the the assignment of taking a look at the zoning code. One of the things we found when the code got put together, these prescriptive design standards don't have any relief valve. In other words, if we run into a dead end with someone, the code doesn't provide us any avenue, or very much of an avenue for an alternative. So you sort of negotiate something, sit down at a table and say, let's see if we can figure out a way. The code is prescriptive. So just to give you one example, we'll use this Kroger Marketplace site plan, just to give you an idea of some things we run into. Take a look at this row of buildings down here.
Let's orient. This is, yeah.
Turnpike Road is Turnpike. This is Frederick Boulevard. This is, of course, under construction Kroger Marketplace back here. And this is conceptual.
Know where you are?
Yes.
This is conceptual. This part, of course, has been approved. If you recall, there was a use permit in here. We'll talk about why. In fact, there was two. There was a type 2 development plan approved in here for the parking. But I just want to talk about some of the problems we run into. This may seem small, but take a look at this. This would be little shops. This would be a row of shops. And if you think about the backside of almost any shopping center, if you come down the ramp off of at Victory behind, you can look over and see the backside of that set of stores. So think about that, for example. And for this exercise, ignore this building. Presume that's not there. So when we go look at the zoning code, what does it tell us design-wise we're supposed to look for? Well, it tells us that this building is near the street over here. The code wants you to frame the street because you're at an intersection. So it tells you to pull the building over here. And then it tells you another thing. It says not only put it over here, that's the front. Okay, so now you got a shopping center. That becomes the back of the building. And you can imagine shopping center developers are not really pleased.
About being in the back.
Say that's got to be the back of your building. They say, well, that's the front of our building. And we say, that's okay. make that a double front.
That's
Of
right.
course, they like that even less. And then we say, well, there's another option. We have a requirement you put in glass in here. There's a glazing standard from between 2 and 8 feet. And so then there's a standard you have to have glass back there. So
Now think about that. I mean, what do you put at the back of the building? The restrooms, you put your storeroom, you put.
Your drainage.
Not glass.
That's right. No good.
So the point of all this isn't so much that you have a design standard, it's just we don't have any alternatives. You know, we sit down with somebody and we'll say, it's 40% glazing standard back here. End of discussion. And that's really not a good place to be.
What do you do?
They
For
get
the
mad and they
situation
yell at me and then they call the city manager is what really happens. So,
And it takes up a lot of
Come
time
back, it
too. I mean,
does.
we're trying to work to yes. And even if we didn't have this zoning ordinance, we would be concerned about how the back of the building looks. But when you tell somebody that's your front, and they look at you and say, really? You're nuts.
Yeah, I would too.
so we'll do one other quick little example that's come up on the same site. Ignore this building. Assume this building's a little bit larger, a little bit closer to the street, and decide you're going to take this unit on the end and you're going to put a drive-through.
Okay.
You've got a restaurant wants to go in here and they want a drive-through right in here. And so we're like, okay, drive-throughs are pretty common, except the zoning ordinance says you can't have a drive-through on the end of a building facing a street if you're within 150 feet of the street. So, and that is the end of that story. You know,
That's
so,
right.
And they come back and say, well, wait a minute, I've already got my tenant lined up. And guess what? On this particular building, I've got 2 restaurants, or what looks like a restaurant, one at this end and one at that end.
And they both want drive-throughs.
Did something like this apply when the Chick-fil-A was being built? Because
Oh, yeah.
that's
Oh, yeah.
very
Oh, yeah.
unique and
Yes.
Yeah, and you can, as new buildings, you'll see some positive benefits of these standards. The CVS, I guess, the CVS, you can see it's a much nicer looking building than you might have gotten otherwise. So you can see there's positive once you work with it. What we're trying to get past is the answer's no, and it knows your answer. And so, you know, we're trying to figure out what we want to do is start to work on fixing the code so we have some flexibility, some design flexibility, some alternatives. You know, what else might you do back there to make the building look attractive, you know, other than what you've got? Or in the lease, like we go back to the form-based code example with Columbia Pike. At the end of the day, if you don't do form-based code on Columbia Pike, you can request a use permit or special exception and go to the Board of Supervisors in the county and argue your case. In our code, there's simply nowhere to go.
There's nowhere to go.
And we don't believe it's appropriate if you follow standard zoning law, that you tell somebody to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals and argue about the glass on the back of their building. That's really not a confiscation type of a situation. So all of these, just trying to point out, you've got a zoning code, it's very complicated. I call it a hybrid. It's made up of multiple types of zoning philosophy. It's got a few underpinnings to it, which are good. It wants better design quality. It's trying to be pedestrian friendly. Has a few things that all these codes tend to run in, which is when you take codes or code philosophy that's urban in nature, and you try to apply it on a suburban land use grid or suburban land use standard. So we've got, you know, a city that's got suburban land use in it. You try to put something on top of it, you're going to run into conflicts. And so I just mentioned, John had mentioned amending the zoning code. I'm just going to prepare you to be regularly amending the zoning code. As we work through these issues, we're trying to do some of them be quickly, some of them will take a little more time, some of them might, you know, require a lot more study, because the one thing we don't want to do is overreact to a one case or 2 cases. But when you start to see the same problem occurring and the staff gets frustrated with it, of course the developers are beyond frustrated, but nobody likes to be with the staff person going, look, I know it doesn't make any sense, or seems like it doesn't make any sense, or I wish we had an alternative, or I wish there was something else we could do.
How do our sister cities address it?
Yeah.
Well, a couple ways. They don't have this kind of zoning.
Right.
Suffolk has, if you look at their Unified Development Ordinance, they have some provisions, not quite as, I think one thing you have to recognize in our code, it's like the newest thing on the block. And it's got concepts in it that aren't, you really can't compare place to place, except I say a few things. Virginia Beach has now adopted form-based code for the oceanfront. So they do have a version of form-based code in there. And they're not always sort of structured the same, but they use it. And you are seeing more localities put more design standards, you know, into their codes. But we've pretty much gone, because I don't know if anywhere else has sort of thrown the old zoning code out and dropped in a new one. And if you do that, you're going to run into,
So other than Virginia Beach at the oceanfront, we're the only city that, on the south side at least, with form-based code?
I think
Basically.
that's probably correct. I know Albemarle County uses the Transect, the smart code.
Yeah.
These are, I'm sorry.
No. And let me, before it gets too far, he says the newest thing on the block. And that's the problem. It hasn't been field tested. And so it's being field tested now. We're finding that, it needs modification. So it may look good on paper, but when you try to apply it in a practical sense, that's when these unintended consequences really glare at you.
So we're getting pushback from developers?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this became a big brouhaha here on this. Remember, there are two developers. One is Kroger's, and remember, they have two conditional use permits. One because of the size of the building, and one because of the drive-through. Well, I can understand maybe the drive-through, but not the size. I mean, you want big buildings on a site like this. And so there's some philosophical things, and we want to share with you a philosophy. We don't think that the administration should be the arbitrator of architectural design. And that should be a community decision. It should have civic engagement. We shouldn't be the city's architect per se. Am I making sense? That's what this comes down to with the form-based code. It's this way or no way.
So before a building if the building has been designed and we bring it to city, to make sure that we're in play with where the zoning materials are, where the zoning criteria is available, you can tell us to change the building?
Well, actually, let's look at the options that we got here. What Bob is talking about is that if you had let's say the zoning ordinance says you can't put a drive-in there. The appeals process could be a conditional use permit, which allows then public engagement, civic engagement. The public gets a chance to say. And think about all the zoning issues that you've considered in your career. Often it's a community. There's no right or wrong answer per se. Let's say your neighbor wants to do a home business and needs a conditional use permit. You make your decision on what does the community want. And there's no process in this for determining what the community wants here, if I'm making sense.
And I want to add one last kind of important part of the way this thing works. If you go back here, if you're back in where we're doing the Transect, the form-based code, and I mentioned the philosophy is function follows form. We get the building design to look right. We'll get its relationship with the street to look right. Yeah. We'll get the parking and the landscaping to look right. And then we'll sort of let the uses kind of fill themselves in appropriately the way the community wants the place to look. Well, one of the problems with that is, as you can imagine, and I don't know of any place in which the city council has said, let's just have a free-for-all on land uses and see whatever goes in there. So if you want to put a adult, entertainment in there and a tattoo parlor and a whatever. And so most communities have taken some of the Euclidean concepts of a use table and they put it back into the form-based code. So we're still going to have some standards in there that come from what we're comfortable with having land use regulation. And that also creates, potential conflict between a regulatory, land use kind of a scheme and a design concept that's designed to work without it. And so, in our case, one of the other things that happened is all these codes weren't all put together by the same, working with the same consulting firm. So we've got some additional issues out there with some inconsistencies between the documents themselves, the terminology, so it's a number of things. So, we're committed to going back and trying to get to, and I just refer to us being like mechanics. We're going to go in and try to keep the car running, and then we're going to get this thing up to speed best we can. We think we've got some steps to take. Some are relatively small. Some of them be, a little bit more complicated. But the goal is to get the land use regime to work so that the city isn't chasing people away. But we're also not letting anybody build anything and everything. There's some standards here. That was one of the goals, is to promote a higher quality development standard. So,
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to add. There's an enormous amount of positivity to this form-based code. We need to find a way to tweak it, but this is nationally recognized. The Virginia Beach came over here, and we sent people over to assist them
Right.
because we were so I don't want to make it sound like that we're throwing this thing out or slamming it. We need to find a way to tweak it because it keeps you from allowing people to come into your city and coercing 2 or 3 elected officials, and this building looks like this, the next building looks like something else. You need uniformity, you need to have those standards, and so you don't want to, I hope the presentation isn't, Bob, we're trying to throw all this out.
no, in fact, what we're
Okay.
trying to fix.
We want to tweak.
And so I'll give you
Give us some
just
flexibility,
One example.
right?
I'll give you one example.
Okay.
Let's talk up here where, in fact, you can correct me if I get my facts wrong here, but let's go where quarters at Parkview. And if you look at the form-based code, it doesn't have like a typical setback, just build it back. It has a build to line. It says you must have X amount of your building sitting at a certain location. Let's say it's 0, okay, up on the sidewalk. Okay, sounds really good until the developer goes out there and finds a force main in his 0.
Right.
Okay, the code gives you no
No
guidance as to
flexibility.
where to put the building then. The developer's not moving the force main, and the code doesn't tell you what to do with the setback. That's what we're talking about. These are the kind of things we run into a roadblock, and you end up in a arm wrestling match because the code doesn't provide you any.
Can you all visualize that? Here's the property, okay? The code says build to the property line, but running parallel to the property line is a force main.
That's right.
And so you're not going to build on top of a force main. And there's no way that we can handle that. There's no mechanism. And we didn't say throw the whole thing out. We're talking about tweaking. We're talking about fixes.
All right, that's fine.
And we're talking about being able to work to yes, and instead of just looking at the developer, whoever the developer might be, and say no.
So this tweaking is at the result of feedback from numerous developers?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it didn't start with Bob coming on board. I sensed it from the very beginning. And talking with developers, talking with developments just like the one that you used here, there's no safety valve, there's no relief valve, there's no way to get to yes on that.
Well, we need flexibility. We need to find a way to introduce that to what we're doing here, and it's going to take some iterations to do that.
Let me give one more example. I'm going to give the Mojo Bones example. I
Yeah.
think this is one, most of you probably heard the Mojo Bones story. We'll give you a pictorial view of the zoning problem. So again, picture form-based code. Here's Effingham, and then you're into I'm going to refer to here as being east of Effingham. If you look at the zoning code says if you are east of Effingham down here, 0 parking requirement, okay? And we know we have parking garages and all that, 0 parking requirement. If you go in the form-based code, let's just use a restaurant as an example. If you're over here, if you're in a building that's 2,500, if you're in a building that's 8,000 square feet or smaller, no parking requirement. But I think if you just realize where I was looking, there's this spot right here. You see that? You recognize this yellow line. That's your downtown design area, what you see outlined in yellow. It's in T5. This is west of Effingham, not in the D2. Okay, so east side, no parking. West side in the D2, no parking. But you go to the 800 block in here, let's have 50 parking spaces for you. Or if you're your restaurant, what was it, 13 or 15? 19. Well, these are buildings that have no parking. These are wall-to-wall buildings. So this is an error. I'm just telling you, this is an accident, But that keeps the developer from coming to town.
Sure.
Because there's no parking plan. So, spend a lot of time and effort working on that section that's, east of Effingham. You got parking garages and parking strategies. And over here, it's been taken care of in the scale of development that's anticipated over here. But there's a fix. That's a tweak. It's a fix. We've got one in mind how to fix it. That just sort of points out when you run into some of these issues, that need some adjustment. And I'll just say, again, I go back to the old code. We modified and amended the zoning code. It's not a new process. In this case, so you're running into them in a number of places, and we just need to get busy, trying to fix the things that need to be fixed.
Ms. Wren?
Yes, the thing too is a shifting in the paradigm. It's a whole new structure that we are looking at in the city, because there was a time, there was a purpose for it being blocked off the way it was. And we have to face that. And in order to correct it, it's just like redesigning and developing that whole area that had been designed for the specific purpose.
Right.
And that's what you're doing. You're tweaking it to try to make it more open and progressive for the city to expand out rather than to hold in. It's not me buying out, it's our.
Well, I just make one comment. I think we all know the simple rules. If you're working in a green field,
There you go.
anything will work,
That's right.
right?
That's
When
right.
you're working where there's stuff already there, you got to be a little more creative. You got to be a little
To
bit
get
more
around it.
sensitive to what's there.
That's
And
right.
what we're talking about. We're trying to make it something that works. And this, I'm going to tell you the term I use for it. I don't know if everybody does. This is transformational zoning.
That's right.
turning it from what it was to something different. And anytime you go to do transformational zoning,
That's hard.
you're going to have some bumps in
That's
the
right.
road. And
Bob, are we looking at a exception process, and if so, at what level of a exception approval?
well, that's what we haven't. That's what we're talking about. We're going to go figure out exactly which way to handle these things. I think I mentioned in the form-based code of Columbia Pike, they have a concept that says, here's our form-based code. They built in some administrative, what I talked about, the ability to have the staff modify within reason that stays within the parameters of the goal of the form-based code. And then to say, but if you got a good project and you can't comply, it's really, in their case, the Board of Supervisors' ultimate decision whether they think that's in the best interest of the city. And what we're trying to get to in the same kind of case, the staff should never be the final roadblock. It's not good zoning practice that we end up being the final roadblock. There needs to be, and normally under zoning, you go Board of Zoning Appeals or there's a use permit. In this case, quite frankly, these codes just don't have that built
Flexibility.
into them that way.
And Bob said it so much better than I did when I was trying to say we don't want to be the final architect.
That's
I mean,
right.
there needs to be a way to get around this.
So just make it clear, we're talking about making it better, not
Yeah.
making it
Or
work. This isn't
restricted.
about, let's throw it out and I'll hand Fred his book and say, let's get back to this one again. This is not the idea. The idea is to make what we have in place work like it's intended to work. And these
The
all these.
hybrid concept.
Beneficial to the public.
Hybrid concept.
Yeah, it's a hybrid. The hybrid is
gotta blend it.
multiple zoning philosophies, kind of. We have another piece in there I'll mention. If you go into our, outside of downtown, what I call the Euclidean with the development standards, there's a piece of incentive zoning in there too. You want to go look that up, there's another concept that got built into the code. And incentive zoning, if you hear people going through the type 2 development review process, that's an incentive zone. If you look at the requirements to go through the type 2 development process, the developer is supposed to provide some additional public benefits for the right to go through that process. So they're getting some relief from a development standard to do something different, but to be approved to do that, there's a list of public benefits they're supposed to be, choosing from to try to make, something, a benefit to the public for getting the relief in that case. That's incentive zoning. It's used in different ways. That's kind of a modest form of incentive zoning, but that's why this is a hybrid. It's got a lot of different types of zoning built into it. It's not the old, sort of one size fits all.
Now, before we leave this, I want you to think about two more things. We got this ordinance, or these books, which more than one. But add to that what's happening with stormwater, the new regulations, and the impact that that's going to have on development. Add to that what's happened with floodplain and the impact that that's going to have on development. And then you add this together with a zoning ordinance that doesn't have the term that's being used in the news right now, exit ramps, so to speak. All the doors are closed. In fact, there are no doors to try to get out of the box.
And I do think that it's true. I think when the new floodplain regulations come into effect, a lot of these requirements are going to have to get looked at. For example, where they want you to have, at-grade entry into buildings from the sidewalk when the buildings end up getting lifted, 3-4 feet higher than the sidewalk at the front door or whatever. Codes are going to have enough flexibility that we don't say, sorry, we've reached an impasse again. So that's, again, what we talk about having, there's got to be some common sense. Maybe that's a better way to put it. Some common sense built into the way the code works. It's not just hard line design requirements.
So how do you propose to do that, Bob? Because, you don't want to keep running into, every time a developer runs into a snag, we got an issue, and you certainly don't want to go through and try to create every scenario that somebody may bring to the city, because we'll be back where we are, because a developer's going to show up in every scenario you thought of except the one he wants to build, and he'll be calling us saying, you guys are hard to work with, can you change this? And we say, well, we just voted on this new one last week.
That's the beauty of developers, no matter what you say, they always have another idea, and quite frankly, they're good at truth testing. That's what I like to refer to as what we call truth testing the code. Will it work on the ground? It's good, it looks good, it looks nice in the book. Makes sense when you read it. When somebody comes and try to build to it, do these things work? Are they in sync? And we'll talk about some other things that aren't, but that's a really key. What we
I think make sure you have latitude or a door or an exit ramp so we can visit those things when they pop up, and not try to sit here and come up with all of the possibilities, because we'll never get there.
Quick suggestion, a few things we're looking at doing. Okay, we're going to take a very quick look with some design assistance at the development standards that are going to applied outside of downtown. So let's go to the Kroger Marketplace situation. We know we're running into issues out here. It's not just them. We had it with Wawa. You see them come through. We had it with Royal Farms. See those guys. Every project's had. Now, sometimes it takes a while. It might take you 2 or 3 months, but you kind of get to a solution. But that's too long.
Okay.
It's really too long.
Absolutely.
So in those areas, we're going to take a look at those development standards. We're going to do, I'll call like a sort of a decision tree. So we're going to go, let's look at the development standard. Is it needed or not? Let's not have unnecessary standards in there. But if you need it, okay, is the one that's in there, is that good or not? And if it's good, does it need more flexibility, or does it need an alternative? You need to build that in there. And the last one is, if all of those things aren't being met, but you still have a good project, the developer still should have some sort of an option to get into a use permit type process, at least my opinion. I'm not sure if everyone shares, to go and let city council ultimately decide, is this in the best interest of the community to build it this way, knowing that it's not exactly what's in the ordinance, but we still think on its merits it's a good project. So that's having some relief. So that'd be one of the first things we talked about doing.
Okay.
I think in downtown, oops, wrong way. We know when we get in this downtown area, one of the problems we're having is just because these books are so complicated, there's a high likelihood of missing something or some confusion in there. We think the first thing we need to do pretty quickly is get together, I'm going to call it a design manual. Something that goes, if you're in the T5 district, here's what you need to be doing, here's where the use permit triggers are. Because later on, we got to come back and look at some of these use permit triggers. So we have some crazy, in my opinion, crazy triggers in there that aren't helpful. And they aren't really consistent with either, I think, what council needs, what the code is intended to do. So we want to look at those things. And I'll just give you an example. If you're a believer in form-based code, like the mayor's mentioning there, and you want that to work, you cannot have, every time the developer turns, there's a use permit requirement on you, because the whole point is to not have too many of those. So you can get into a case where we have a trigger that if one floor of your building is too big, that could be a trigger. If the size of your building is too big, that could be a trigger. If your density is not correct, that could be a trigger. None of those are all the same. Now, in the old days, you had one use permit, you say, just get one, everybody gets one. In this case, it looks like you don't need one. This is what gets developers upset. They don't think they need one, and then they need one because of some design thing. And this is just sort of a philosophical thing. When the use permit triggers not the use, it's the design. And so that's one of those things we'd want to look at in there. So we're going to take a look at trying to figure those things out. And when we ultimately come back to do big major code amendments, clean those things up and try to get it to function in the way it's intended, where you only get use permits on those rare occasions where it's the kind of use you ought to really be concerned about, not every little design element somebody makes, all of a sudden it triggers a use permit, because that's really contrary to the whole point of having a form-based code.
And we brought in developers together to to ask them about the things like the triggers?
We've started some of that.
Being surprised about use permits?
And I've had people offer to come in to work with us on that. In fact,
Because I think that would
I'll
be
mention,
good.
let me see if I have it. I don't know if I have it here. My first week, I don't have it in my code. My first week here, I decided to go out and visit the quarters at Parkview. They're just under construction with Dan Aston. And I was just curious. I said, well, this is the first big project under form-based code. How was it? He said, oh, man, I got some stories to tell, And so I said, okay. He wrote me 5 pages of his story about it. And very entertaining, but he points
He's
out
a
some very-
six-pager kind of guy, so that was pretty
so
good.
some very
They only gave you
significant
5.
points of frustration points. Now, some of those are just typical developer frustration points. So some of those are, I've hit a wall, or hit a wall and it delayed, or, So those are very good points. So, the council meeting, we definitely are going to bring developers in to help us go through this. We're going to have probably more, when we get into that level, more community input again. Want to make sure, and I think this is something John said earlier, these standards in here, these are supposed to be community standards. They're not supposed to be Bob standards or, these are community standards. What does a community want to look like? And that's what this code is supposed to be. Let's go put my planner hat back on. You do a comprehensive plan and say, this is what we want. This code is supposed to implement that. And so this is where the community is supposed to be saying, that's doing what we want. So if you like what it's generating, then it's working to some degree. If you don't, and that's another level of conversation. So if we get any significant kind of change, we're definitely going to want community input. And of course, there's always public hearings, but we're going to want to get more. But we also definitely want to talk to developers and their architects and help them, have them help us identify some of these things so that, we get a broad view. We have our own, we see it from our side of the seat and our side of the table. So that's the plan. And then this will be a work in progress, just like the old code was.
I like it. I think the fear I have is when you don't have something like a form-based code and you come back and drive through that area in 20 years from now and you got this hodgepodge of stuff on every corner and then somebody looks and go, who in the world did that? And that's what form-based code does for you. You don't want it so rigid that you're running developers away, but you don't want every developer coming in here trying to con you out of putting this here or that there. And I mean, there's a happy medium, but we need to make sure that we're going to be proud of the revitalization that we're trying to do to this old city and not have that. I mean, I think if you ride up and down those corridors now, you'll see some things that you would not have done back then when they allowed it, but it was because somebody had money, say, I'll do it, and you say, hey, name that tune. And so the next week, somebody else showed up across the street with something else, we said, name that tune. And so you're sitting here looking at.
So hundreds of examples of bad things.
Was
Right,
That's
right.
the
this
side.
code in place when you did the courthouse in the middle of an industrial area?
That was crazy.
I just,
2010. Well, that now, of course, is a special district. Another-
Special
another-
district, because you got sued by the Commonwealth.
That's another form-based
And the
code.
Commonwealth said you're going to do it or else. But anyway, very good. I like the flexibility piece. Thank you. Yep. Good job, Bob.
oh, you're talking about what they did in the first one?
We need a closed meeting.
Yep, yes, ma'am.
I have 2 questions before we go into close, please.
3 questions.
Only 2. First one is, when are we going to get an update on food trucks? On how
I'm glad
this-
you asked that question.
He sounds like a politician, doesn't
They
he?
on
Right?
every block.
I told Elizabeth I may have precipitated this because I've had in the last month the occasion to enjoy the benefits of a food truck in Norfolk, and it was a quite pleasant experience. You last discussed this on the 23rd of September, and on a 4-3 vote, you said move, but move slow, and get the regulations and bring them back. The regulations I gave to our staff that I also said your top priority is the zoning ordinance. And we're working on the food truck, but the sense of the zoning ordinance matter, and I don't want to diminish the amount of time that goes and the amount of emotion that goes into this. We end up with some hot people. Mojo Bones, for example, the developer was really exercise, to the point that he felt that he was being, because he wasn't born in America, that there might be some other reason why we're not moving ahead on that. And Brandon made the offer to go visit him at his office, and that takes time. So we're working on it, is the answer, and we hope to get something to you by the end of the spring.
I haven't had the first inquiry about what happened to food trucks.
I have, that's
I
why I'm
would too, I
asking.
have
Yeah.
a lot of
No,
problems.
it died off.
Well, much more importantly, how about Churchland High School's air?
It's my understanding from an email that the school superintendent has had a testing company test the quality of the air.
The air.
And from that email, he said that he was going to let us know, us being a collective us, what the results were.
Okay. All right.
Us and the public.
Yeah, us, the collective us.
All right. Somebody take us in the close.
Move to go into closed meeting pursuant to the provisions of Virginia Code Section 2.2-3711 for the following purpose: briefing by staff in consultation with legal counsel regarding a legal matter as permitted under subsection A7.
Second.
Mr. Cherry?
Yes.
Mr. Edmonds?
Yes.
Mr. Meeks?
Yes.
Mr. Moody?
Yes.
Ms. Simmons?
Yes.
Ms. Randall?
Yes.
Mayor Wright?
Yes.
We are in closed. Thank you.
Okay.